Today is February 27th of 2020. This is an interview of Donald Sadoway, who is professor of materials chemistry at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the Department of Material Science and Engineering. The interviewers are Ho Jong Kim and myself, Antoine Alano.
Don, would you tell us about where you grew up?
Yeah, so I was born in Toronto, and at the age of 3, my parents moved to Oshawa. It's a town about 35 miles east of Toronto, and that's where I grew up all the way through high school, and then returned to Toronto, where I attended the University of Toronto.
So, next question is, who or what influenced you to become an engineer?
Well, that's an interesting question because it's quite by accident, actually. I was really interested in teaching. So when I went to the University of Toronto, I went with the intention of getting a bachelor's degree and maybe returning to Oshawa to teach high school, something in the sciences. But once I got to the University of Toronto and I saw the professors, I said, I like that. So, of course, to become a professor, you needed a PhD. And to get a PhD, you had to do research. And so I was required to do research. And then, en route to getting the PhD and doing research, then that had me migrate over into engineering. And why I was engineering? Because I didn't really understand what engineering was. I enjoyed science, but then the University of Toronto was very, it really worked for me that they called the School of Engineering, which they called the faculty, they called it the Faculty of Applied Science and Engineering, because I don't think I would have chosen engineering. I would have chosen science, which would have been a mistake for me. But applied science was ideal because it captured the notion of science applied to what? And I didn't realize these words yet. I've since coined the phrase science in service of society. So applied science is at the cusp between science and application, which later I learned is what engineering is. But anyways, so that's a long answer to your question.
Right, that's a great answer, actually. So, did any of your professors mentor you in any particular way?
Oh, absolutely. I wouldn't be here if it weren't for a few key people along the way. I mean, the main one was Professor Spiro Flengas. He was at the University of Toronto. He came from Greece, and he did his PhD after the war in London, King's College. He told me, he said for 3 years, he said he was in a tunnel underneath the Thames, and he says the river was dripping on the back of my neck for 3 years. And then he came to Canada, and he worked at the equivalent of the Bureau of Mines in Ottawa. And then he hired on at the University of Toronto. And I met him in my third year. It was clear. See, the interesting thing is that I didn't choose the topic. I chose the person. It's said in some sectors of venture capital, you don't bet on the technology, you bet on the team. And I was doing the same thing. I didn't realize it at the time, but of all of the faculty that were at the University of Toronto in material science at the time, he struck me as the most interesting person. You know, he came from Greece. He was European. He had the British education. And he happened to work in high temperature electrochemistry. If he'd been a ceramist, I would have followed in his footsteps and become a ceramist. But I'm really glad that he was a high temperature electrochemist. And it wasn't just what I learned from him in terms of the technical, but the way he carried himself, the way he conducted himself, and that had a powerful influence. And then when I finished my PhD, I won a NATO fellowship, and it allowed me to go anywhere in NATO. And I chose to come to MIT because I had been reading the 4 books, the paperback Wolf series, and they were written by MIT faculty, and those were fantastic books. And I said, I want to go there. And so Flengus said, well, so you're going to work for Elliott? And I said, no. I had met Szekely. Szekely had come. He was Hungarian. He'd fled Hungary in 1956 and got his PhD again in London. He was a chemical engineer, formally. And then he came to Canada, and he worked with Nick Themelis at a chemical company in Montreal. And then he got a job at State University in New York, Buffalo. And he was in Buffalo, and at that time Buffalo had a very strong industrial base, including a plant of Bethlehem Steel. And so he linked up with the steel company and started doing things. And at one point, while I was a graduate student, he came to Toronto and he gave a lecture. And again, I was just totally stunned. His presence in the room, he was wild. And when I told Flengus that, no, actually I'm going to work with Szekely, and he says to me, they say he's mad. You know, he's mad. And he called him Julius instead of Julian. I said, no, it's Julian. Anyways, he cautioned me. And I said, no, I'm going to ignore this. I mean, and when I was a postdoc with Julian for a little bit less than a year, at that time he organized a conference of people from the steel industry. And I was the postdoc, so I did all of the legwork, of course. And so I met all these people, and the stuff that we talked about, it was, today we don't think about stuff like this, but in 1977, 78, to have a professor, being interviewed by 33 magazine, business things and technical things, the professors, they were professors. But Julian was already out there doing this, and I looked at that and said, I can do that if I grant myself permission. So most definitely there were key people.
That's really exciting experience, and then you had a great opportunity to work with him, right?
Yeah.
My next question is, did you have any classmates that influenced your studies?
Yes, I did. When I got to Toronto as a first-year student, I really didn't know how to properly study. Things came easy to me. So I was, top of my class in high school, and I studied at some level. But when I got to Toronto, I was in engineering science, which is the honors engineering program. It was very demanding. In fact, on the first day, I remember there was a gathering of the engineering science students, because we actually chose the department major as an incoming freshman. There was no general first year. So I chose engineering science. And there was 181 majors. And we met in the basement of the Royal Ontario Museum. And the director of the program was Professor Donald Ivey, who he and Patterson jointly they put out the video series, Physics Secondary Science Project, which was the terms of this were set forth by Gerald Zacharias out of MIT, but Ivy and Patterson did these videos, and they taught Newtonian mechanics and electricity and magnetism in these videos. So this is now Donald Ivy, who I've seen in video, and he comes out and he welcomes us and he says, "Look to the man on your left and the man on your right." I thought he was going to say, one of you won't make it to the second year. He says, one of you will make it to second year. And 2 out of 3 people dropped out of that program. That's how severe it was. Most of them went just to the regular engineering. Pardon me. But yeah, there were 60 of us on the first day of the second year. In fact, the Eng-Sci dropout was an institution of itself. There were more dropouts than there were people in the major. So there was Eng-Sci dropout hockey team, Eng-Sci dropout baseball team, everything. And I was struggling. And I met classmate Frank Palmy. I know him to this day. He was he was a child of Hungarian immigrants. And one thing that I did learn from my strict Victorian education in Oshawa was how to write. And Frank was brilliant. In fact, he was first in the class, as it turns out, but I didn't know it at the time. So he was puzzled by the lab notebooks that he was not getting the top grades in the lab notebook in the physics lab, and he asked the TA. We called them demonstrators. He asked the demonstrator, I don't know, what's wrong with this? He points to me, he says, you should go talk to him. He really knows how to write. So I met Frank because he wanted to see how I was writing my lab reports, and we became good friends. And then we became part of a study group because I didn't understand I did everything by myself through high school. But now we had a study group, and so that was really influential for me.
That's great. That's great. So this question can be a little bit redundant because you already described some of your experience. But did you have any influences or mentors?
Did I have influences from mentors?
Or mentors. Influences or mentors?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, this goes beyond. I think I'll be a little bit personal here. I think what drives me, it was my family, and in particular my grandmother, my mother's mother. Now, background on them. So, both sides of my family are Ukrainian. On my father's side, they came to Canada before World War I, and so Western Ukraine was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So they came to Canada as Austrians, Austrian nationals. There was no, Ukraine was not recognized as a national entity because it was partitioned between the Russian Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So World War I breaks out and they are on Austrian passports. So they were designated enemy aliens, and there was internment camps, and my father's father, whenever he left the house, he had to wear a big letter A for alien, and so on. On my mother's side, they came right after World War I. Western Ukraine they dismembered the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Western Ukraine was glommed onto the newly created Polish Republic. Well, the xenophobia was strong, so if you weren't Polish, you didn't want to stay. So they came to Canada. My mother's mother was born in 1892. She was completely illiterate. At the age of 9, she was already working as a servant girl in the manor of a Polish landlord. But that woman had such a sense of a community duty. She was active in social organizations and active in the church, in sort of ladies' auxiliary, which was always involved in service. And And she was a very powerful influence on me. And so I sort of appropriated that, the notion that you're part of a larger community, and that to serve is a noble act. So then if you think about service as a noble act, and you think about passion for applied science, then it becomes science in service to society. And I think that's the genesis of it. It's not because I want to fight for climate change mitigation or something like that. It's very simple.
I'm very glad where that quote comes from your personal experience in your childhood.
Yeah.
So we're gonna switch ahead in time. We were curious about what are the most important contributions that you have brought to the field of metallurgy. Maybe as a background, you worked in the steel industry for a little bit. Your advisor at MIT was someone from the iron and steel industry. You said it before, and then your advisor in Toronto was in chemical metallurgy, molten salt, and some electrochemistry. So you really cover, two of the most important metals along your career. Can you share with us some of the contributions you've made to either of these metals and this field?
Well, I think that in the area of the aluminum, there was work on melt speciation. We did some Raman work, and Raman work in situ. We had electrolysis cells with transparent windows so that we could do Raman while we were doing electrodeposition. There was some nice observations there. And then, of course, in the 80s, there was a big push for inert anodes. And the inert anode was really formative. I think I have something that's a very nice inert anode, but it was never deployed because things moved on. But it served as the basis for our work later when you came on board and then pushed it over the finish line with molten oxide electrolysis. But that was an important stepping stone. So the whole enterprise with aluminum was really good because it started to focus me on applied electrochemistry, high temperature electrochemistry. And there was also a lot of work on the magnesium as well. And similarly, the magnesium didn't need the inert anode because they were able to use carbon. But still, there was a very interesting work in the fluid dynamics and so on, because in magnesium, the metal and the gas go up. In aluminum, the metal goes down and the gas goes up. And then it was during the course of the search for the inert anode for aluminum that I stumbled upon the MOE, because the molten oxide electrolysis, it came about because I was thinking about changing electrolyte composition. And I remember there was a meeting once at MIT, because we had some grant money from the Department of Energy, and they had asked Warren Halpin, who was a high-ranking researcher at Alcoa, to act as sort of an adjudicator. And he visited me at MIT, and I was working with John Haggerty and a few other people. And I was thinking about, at one point, for an inert anode to use something like a very conductive oxide, something like lanthanum chromite. And but the lanthanum chromite would be sparingly soluble in the electrolyte. So I said, well, maybe we could seed the bath with a lanthanum compound and thereby prevent further dissolution. And so I threw this idea out, and Halpin practically lunges out of his chair and he says, "You mean you're proposing to change the composition of the bath?" And I thought, yeah. And he looked at me as though I'd just committed some vulgar act in public. And I realized that, you know, their problem was so constrained. They wanted to just pull out the one carbon element, the anode, and replace it with some magical material and touch nothing else. And I was already thinking about, well, if you want to optimize the anode, you make other adjustments as well. And then I freed my mind and I started thinking, well, you know, the whole thing is stupid. You have an oxide feedstock and it's only sparingly soluble in cryolite. I mean, homage to Hall and Herul, but maybe there's something even better. And I started thinking, well, like dissolves like. I was already teaching a freshman chemistry, and I said, well, if you have an oxide feed, why don't you have an oxide solvent? And then I started spinning in my brain the idea of an oxide solvent for an oxide feed, but a conducting oxide could be the anode, but it could also be the feedstock. And so then I conceived of an iron oxide, a magnetite, which at those temperatures would be an electronic conductor, and it would be dissolving desirably. So it's not an inert anode. It is a consumable anode, but a carbon-free anode. And the solvent is an oxide solvent, and that was the genesis of the molten oxide electrolysis. I subsequently realized that it sounds like a great idea, but the anode member, it's at 1600 degrees at the splash line of the melt, but in the upper parts, it's much lower temperature to the point where it's not conductive. So but it got me thinking in the right direction. And so I guess I've wandered a lot on the answer to the question. But anyways, these are sort of little places where there may be some contributions.
And along the lines of, you know, this creative work, innovative work, and difficult work in the field, can you share any of a situation or any of the technical challenges that really slow you down in the path toward some of the great ideas and deployments that happen afterwards?
I mean, it's time on task. You have to have the idea first, and then you surround yourself with bright young students, and if you have the resources, you have the financial resources, and then the financial resources buy you the physical resources. So the most important thing is the idea, and then it's the execution.
Mm-hmm. I was like this version of your optimism, if I may say. It's really always interesting that you have this way of tackling important problems. Clearly, like you described for the inert anode, you're facing challenges, and you flip it around to invent a new way of thinking about the problem, of defining the problem, so that we can move on and continue to think about different ways of doing things.
Yeah, well, I've always said you have to pose the right question. You know, so for example, the quest for the liquid metal battery, I never used the word battery. I want a giant, effective electricity storage device. If I'd said battery, then immediately I would be closing the horizon to something that's a right circular cylinder that fits inside the barrel of a flashlight and thinking how to make that thing big. Instead, I said, I need a storage device. And I looked for inspiration to electrometallurgy. So I looked at the aluminum smelter, and I said, here's something that's big. It traffics in huge amounts of electricity, and it turns dirt into metal for less than 50 cents a pound. If I can teach this thing how to not consume electricity, but to store it and give it back on demand, I know at the end I'm going to have something that's big and cheap. Everybody else starts with a battery that is in the telephone and tries to figure out how to make it the size of a football stadium. So it's by posing the question correctly that you come to new answers. A brilliant answer to a bad question is not science and service to society.
And this brings me to another very important of your contributions to the field, which is in education and teaching, something you have been recognized for, including in extraction and processing division and other type of awards. It sounds like you've been able to come back to your original motivation, that is, you wanted to be a teacher, and clearly you're excelling into that. How did this come back into your life? How did teaching came back into your contribution to the field? Can you describe to us maybe, I guess, your transition within MIT to become a professor, and how your classes and the field has been transformed by your time teaching?
Well, so when I hired on it, so I was a postdoc with Julian, and then he urged me to apply for the faculty position. I wouldn't have applied, but he says no. He knew Ken Bowen, who was the chairing the search committee, and they were actually looking for a physical metallurgist. And then Julian came to me one day and he says, you should put your name in. And I said, oh, no. He says, no, don't edit yourself out. Let them judge. So I put my name in, I interviewed, and to my pleasant surprise, I was offered the position. Well, as you know, as a faculty member at MIT, everybody must teach in addition to research and in addition to some service to the department. You're going to serve on committees and so on and so forth. All right, so I've got to teach. And I was assigned to, my first class was the big first-year chemistry class. I was a recitation instructor, so 3 times a week, Professor Witt did the big lectures, and then twice a week I had 1 hour with about 25 students, basically Q&A format, answering the questions, going over material, and so on and so forth. So that was straightforward and just Q&A. But I watched Professor Witt, and he had a big class. We had filled an auditorium of over 450 students, and I envied that. I liked the big stage because it's about impact. Why teach 30 if you could be teaching 530? And so that was the fall, and then in the spring there was a core class in the graduate curriculum, the kinetic processes and materials, and the department head, Walter Owen, had plans. The person who was teaching it at the time was struggling, and there was sort of rumors that this person was probably not going to make tenure, and so Walter was already grooming me to take that over. So he asked me to take the recitation sections in that class for 1 year, and then the next year I was made the lecturer in charge. Well, I don't like to make a fool of myself, so if you're going to do a job, do it well. And so I worked on that, and the students found it very, very difficult because they as you know, they take thermodynamics in their first semester, and then they take kinetics in their second semester. And it seemed to me that everybody had some comfort level with thermodynamics. Now, granted, they were taken beyond that, but at least they had a point of departure. But my sense was that almost everybody felt unmoored when it came to kinetics. And so that was a prime territory for me, because I could take people that felt unmoored and help them get some grounding, and that was fun. But it was technical. It was a graduate subject, and so on. But then when I was able to take over the major lecturing in the first year chemistry class with the 400 or 500 first year students, that's where I was really able to grow. And because you know, there were little things that happened. So there was a series of epiphanies. Each one of them may be small, but the integral of them all is big. So, for example, the little things. So I had been watching Professor Witt. His name was Gus Witt, August Witt. Also, European immigrant. He was Austrian, and then ended up at MIT. He'd come to work with Godin in hydrometallurgy, and worked with Godin for several years, and then the funding evaporated, and he ended up with Harry Gaydos and migrated over to silicon and made his career in semiconductors and so on. But, you know, if I told you he's Austrian, you figured this is going to be stiff and formal and so on. The man was very warm. And I would go to all of the lectures because I was preparing for the recitation sections. And I would sit almost at the very back of the auditorium because I wanted to get a sense of what it was like to be a student in that auditorium and, you know, feel what the students are feeling at the back. If you're at the front, you think, you know, it's... So I'm at the back and I'm watching this man teach. And he had this conversational way of rolling out the subject matter. And there was no fancy audio visual, nothing. It was one man with a piece of chalk. That's all it was. And I'm sitting there and I feel as though this man is having a one-to-one conversation with 450 people. It was so... that was, for me, an epiphany. How to present the material. Respect your people. You know, I didn't feel like he was the professor and I'm this little kid. I felt as though we were peers. He was talking to me as a peer. He expects that I bring something to the class, like some native intelligence and some background. And he's going to just take me to the next step, next level. So that was big. And he lectured, the lecture periods are 50 minutes. They start at 5 minutes after the hour, they go till 5 minutes before the hour, and then in the intervening 10 minutes you get to empty the auditorium and bring the next carload in. And so he would lecture for 45 minutes on topic, and then the last 5 minutes was something, some kind of an application. You could call it chemistry in the world around us, whatever. And he would try to find something related to the subject matter. And I thought that was very, very interesting. So then, you know, I made sure that I would find interesting things. And I remember I was at home in the summer before I was going to take the major lectures, and I was going through, and there's a lecture on hydrogen bonding. And I said to my wife, you know, I think on the day that I give this lecture, I'm going to play some music. I'm going to play Handel's Water Music, a passage from Handel's Water Music. And she says to me, why only on that day? Mm-hmm. And I said, I don't know. I guess I can do anything I want as long as it's in good taste. So at that moment, I resolved that I was going to, every lecture, the 5 minutes that from the on the hour to 5 minutes after the hour, while the students are entering the lecture hall, I'm playing music. But the music must be thematically linked to the content of the lecture. Now I have to devise the linkages, and it could be classical music, could be world music, it could be rock and roll, popular, whatever. And so, and then the students would start to guess, what is the connection? You know, when there was a lecture on polymers, and I had Aretha Franklin, Chain of Fools. The students loved it because it's, you know, it's linking science to the arts and so on. And then I realized I could bring in literature. When I was teaching the Bohr model of the atom, So I showed them in 5 minutes. I referred to the play by Michael Frayn, Copenhagen, in which Werner Heisenberg goes to see Niels Bohr. It's during World War II, and Denmark is occupied by Germany, and Bohr is essentially captive in Denmark, and Heisenberg is the director of the Nazi equivalent of the Manhattan Project. It's his duty to develop nuclear weapons for Hitler, and he goes to see his old mentor, and that's a fact. And they have dinner, and that's a fact. And they go for a walk, that's a fact. And they never speak to each other after that night. So Frayn writes the novel, the play, about what did they talk about. Did Heisenberg come to ask Bohr, what are the Allies doing? Or did he come to say, should I not do this? Or, look, I'm faking it. Because if I don't do anything, they'll replace me with somebody who will. So I'm going to try to fumble the ball, so to speak. So this is all this speculation. But Heisenberg is all about the uncertainty principle, which is a mistranslation. The German is really the indeterminacy principle. The reason it's uncertain is not because we don't know, it's that we can't measure with greater certainty, all right? And so there's always the observer. So there's three people in this play. There's Bohr, there's Heisenberg, and Bohr's wife. And they're always in a circle, one circling the other, like the Bohr model of the atom. And then the wife, Margaret, is always the observer, and so on. So I bring all this into the class. And then the kids go and read it, and then the connection to literature. When we talk about polymers, I show them the film clip from the iconic movie The Graduate, the scene by the pool where one of the older friends of the family says to the Benjamin, the Dustin Hoffman character, I have just one word, plastics, and so on. And all of this stuff, bringing it all in. When we talk about the oxygen and so on, I showed the scene from the Moulin Rouge, Love is Like Oxygen, showing all of this stuff. And so you can bring all of this in. There are no boundaries. The boundaries are porous. So it's no longer a chemistry class. It's a chemistry-centered class. The ethics are there too. When I teach them DNA, I migrate over to the story of Rosalind Franklin, of how she did the first X-ray of DNA and determined on the base, because they've already seen Lowy backscatter patterns earlier in the subject curriculum. So now it's late. Now we're going to look at DNA, and I show them the image from the paper, where on the basis of the spot pattern, this is an indication that it's a double helix. And she has this data, and her supervisor, Maurice Wilkins, hosts James Crick, who shows up, and he goes with Crick, Wilkins goes with Crick to Franklin's lab, and she isn't present, and he shows Watson the X-ray pattern, and immediately he recognizes it's a double helix, because Linus Pauling had already published that it was a triple helix. And not only on the basis of that pattern do you know it's a double helix, you know that the heavy phosphates are out, not in. So they're not lying inside the double helix. They're on the outside, and so on and so forth. So he gets on the train, goes back to Cambridge, and then they publish. And I show them the paper, 1953, with the image and so on, and the lies in the paper where they say this is based on just our own work, and we thank the others for helpful discussions and so on. And then Rosalind Franklin's paper is next, and I say this is, if this happened today, that paper would have been refuted. And so, by the way, what happens is that Rosalind Franklin is not mentioned in the paper, her name is in the acknowledgments, but nothing about the X-ray pattern. And then I fast forward to the Nobel Prize in 1962, and there's Watson, Crick, and Wilkins, and there's no Rosalind Franklin. And I say, this is unethical. And I point to the whole class and I say, I don't ever want to learn that anybody in this room perpetrates what was perpetrated on her. And by the way, she left the university that she was working at, was required to sign a document saying that she would stop all work in DNA, and went to another college and did some more fantastic work on tobacco virus and all kinds of other stuff. She got cancer, died at age 38, and it's just a terrible story of abuse and exploitation, and it's right at the heart of life science. So you don't put that in an ethics class. You put it right there in the chemistry class so that everybody, and you should see the looks on the students as they're leaving the class after that lecture. They're really angry. They're shocked and angry, and saying, "What is this?" And I said, "This was London, not during the time of Charles Dickens. This was London after World War II." In 1952-53. And by the way, because she was a woman, she was not allowed to go to the common room. So at 4 o'clock, everybody gathers in the common room over a cup of tea, and they discuss things and so on. As a woman, she wasn't allowed to go there, and so on and so forth. When you see the women in the class getting angrier and angrier.
Okay, Don, when did you first hear about TMS and AIST or the membership society? So
TMS was there right from the beginning. If we go back to certainly when I got to MIT, my mentor Julian Zacchelli was very active in TMS, and so I remember the very first TMS meeting was in the winter of 1979, because I had hired on as a faculty member July 1st, 1978. So this was probably February, March of 1979. It was in New Orleans, and it was at the week of Mardi Gras, and it was a historical event. The police went on strike. The police went on strike the weekend before Mardi Gras. So I get to New Orleans. This is 1979. It was rough, and Julian was a little bit miserly, so he didn't stay in the hotel, which is right on the main street there. It was a Sheraton or a Hilton, something like that. He stayed in this little second-tier hotel beyond the canal, and it's about a half a mile away, and you walk past a bunch of warehouses and stuff like this. So I said, well, if he's staying there, I'll stay there too. So it was daunting, but anyways, I survived, and I'm still alive. But that was my first TMS meeting as a junior faculty member. And I've been a member of TMS all the time. And back in those days, the AIME, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but my recollection is, because I remember a lot of steel people being at the meeting, so I don't think that TMS had cleaved from the big steel contingent. So anyway, so I knew people from back in Canada, because I spent one summer working at Dofasco, and there were people from Dofasco attending the meeting, and I was running into them in the dining areas and so on. So it was a big meeting. but then, you know, I've been a member ever since. And then somewhere around, I don't know, certainly by the time you came in 2010, but I think a little bit before that, as I got more and more involved in the molten oxide electrolysis, then I hooked onto AIST. And so, you know, at this point, I've got membership in both.
That's great. So how has the membership benefited you in your career?
Well, membership is critical in the ability to have a conference venue where you can present your freshest results. And you know, certainly you can argue today, well, you have internet and so on, but I'm still not convinced that internet is a substitution for personal presence. And certainly when you're young and you're in the pre-tenure years, the ability to stand up in front of an audience of your peers who are already curated because they have also chosen to join TMS, and they've also chosen to go to this session, which is in your area. You get on the stage, and in 20 minutes, you're able to present yourself, your ideas, and that has a profound impact on people's assessment of you. Because, as I said earlier in the interview, I chose my mentor. I chose the person, not the idea. And I think that the personal representation of the idea is as important as the idea. So you can have a brilliant idea, but if the person on the stage is not persuasive, and I don't mean that in a slick, you know, deceptive way. I mean it that the person has the ability to convey with clarity and with some enthusiasm what he or she is doing, then I think it weakens their chances for success, promotion, recognition, and so on. So I think the society is a fantastic venue. I can't imagine how you could build a career without it. You'd have to go one by one to visit the key people at their home university and hope that they're in town the day that you give your seminar and that they hear you and so on and so forth. Whereas you're here. And plus the chance interactions afterwards. So the professional society is absolutely critical in career building for young people, and for senior people. It's the super highway for conveying information. And plus, the other thing is, at some point the roles are reversed. So you know, I'm coming to a meeting like this, and so for example, one of the people speaking yesterday was Uday Pal, and he mentioned that he attributed his coming to MIT to me. And I remember I was at a professional society meeting, and we were looking for a young hire. And, you know, you can read the resumes, and all the resumes just sparkle. Everybody's fantastic on paper. But you have to see the person. And so what better way to see the person is to say, circle, 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 go to these sessions and watch the person present. And you leave the room and you say, that's a potential hire. Let's invite that person to campus. Or you take a look and say, I mean, the person has amazing resume. The letters of recommendation are very, very strong. But I saw the person, and I don't know what the excitement's all about. But that person is going to wither, you know. So this is, again, the society is fantastic.
That's great. So I'll change a little bit of the question in a little bit different directions. In your opinion, what do you think we can do to attract young people to the science or engineering?
Oh, I think to attract young people to science and engineering, it's the value proposition is the one to take the passion and idealism of young people and say, this is a problem that we need to solve, and it's in your interest and it's in the interest, make the world a better place. Those kinds of things, that has appeal, you know. So it's not about, you know, you really should study harder and be more proficient in mathematics. It's good for you. That's not a value proposition. But you say, you know, if we had grid level storage at the price point of the electricity market, we could have carbon-free electricity everywhere. Do you want to join that struggle? No? Do you want a zero-emission vehicle that's cheaper than internal combustion? Well, come on. What are you doing? I mean, I always said, what are the tough problems and what are you doing about them?
You know, trying to wrap up all the conversations we had, what ultimately, you know, you reflect back on your career, what would be the favorite part?
Favorite part of my career? I think the period with the liquid metal battery, because at that point we had the big amount of funding, big group, and a lot of exciting. I mean, everybody in the group was there because they had a higher sense of purpose. They wanted to change the world. They wanted to make molten oxide electrolysis work, scale, and you joined with the battle to the search for the inert anode, a practical inert anode. And we had the big group that Ho-Jong was in with the liquid metal battery, and those were exciting times. And I was teaching 3091. The big freshman chemistry class. I didn't say, well, now I have more money than the entire Center for Material Science and Engineering. I don't need to teach. I taught in the fall the big first year chemistry class, and in the spring I taught the graduate class in electrochemistry. I never stopped teaching, and so that was the richest mix. And then contemporaneously, along with Louis Ortiz and David Bradwell, we started the company, which, by the way, I did not want to do. You know, I'm from Canada. I was, you know, prim, proper, nice professor, dutiful, teaching, research, committee work, some stuff in the professional societies. I didn't want this company. This company, I thought it was dirty. It was all this money. It was corrupting, and so on. And I think it was Louis. Louis said to me, do you want to change the world? Do you want this technology to succeed? Then you have to push it. You can't just file patents. Paper in nature doesn't change the world. I said, okay. So we started the company. Why? Because my students taught me. If you listen to me, you know, you can learn a lot by listening to other people. Anyway, so that was that period from about 2009 to 2013, and you know that was really exciting because during that time there was a number of events that led to the breakthrough year 2012, which was the invitation for the TED Talk, which came because somebody was reading my work on the liquid metal battery. And there was a member of the board of directors of TED who was writing a book. This was Peter Diamandis. He was writing the book called Abundance, which actually would be relevant to TMS membership. They would enjoy the book. And one of Peter's staff at Singularity University, which Peter had founded. Greg Marignac read the draft chapter on energy, and he told Peter, your stuff on batteries is incomplete. You need to call this guy at MIT. So Peter called me. We had several conversations, and he's on the board of TED. So he says to Chris Anderson, you should invite this guy to give a talk. So I get a call from Chris Anderson, and he says, yeah, I'd really like you to give a talk about your battery. I said, yeah, okay, well, when do you want that? This was in October of 2011. He says, well, the next one in February, March of 2012. I said, why don't we push it a year? Because we'll have way more data and stuff like that. And he says, oh no, I don't want to push it. I want to get it early. And I said, well, I'm from Canada. I do what I'm asked. I said, well, okay. And he says, so tell me, what do you do at MIT? But do you teach as well? I said, oh yeah. I said, what do you teach? I said, I got this big freshman chemistry class. 500 students. There was up to 550 at the time. He said, what kind of media do you use? I said, media? Yeah, like what AV and stuff like that. Oh, it's just me with chalk at a blackboard. He says, would you use a blackboard in your TED Talk? And I said, I guess. Why? He says, I got all these hipsters. They're all over media, computers, and so on. If you could show that you could still lecture with a chalk. And so that's how the TED. And then from TED, there was the Time 100, because I think there was a woman from Time in the audience, and that led to the Time 100. And then that led to the invitation for the Colbert Report. And you can count on less than the fingers of one hand. I guess that should be fewer than the number of fingers on one hand. How many people of high temperature electrochemistry that would have gone on the Colbert Report? So that was those are exciting times.
Indeed, what an impressive career. If you had one piece of advice for the youngest generation, people graduating with a bachelor.
One piece of advice. I mean, it's the usual stuff. Find your passion, follow your passion, pursue it. Aim high. And don't edit yourself. Grant yourself permission. Ask bold questions. Don't live life beige.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for spending the time with us. It was a great pleasure, and thanks for your willingness to share all this history with the society.
Thank you for your probing questions, and it was fun. Thank you.
Thank you very much.